Beginner JavaScript developers make the same mistakes over and over, so here's the top 15 most common ones that I've seen. First is not returning from a function. No matter what calculations you do in a function, unless you use that return keyword, it's not going to return anything except undefined by default. Next is loading JavaScript in the wrong order in your HTML files. Any DOM elements that your JavaScript needs to reference has to already have been loaded inside of the DOM before loading that JavaScript file. Reassigning const variables. Const variables you cannot reassign, let variables you can. Misunderstanding variable scope. Where you declare your variable influences where you're able to access it. Poorly named variables. Name your variables with names that give a little bit of context as to what you are, otherwise it makes code incredibly difficult to read. Having too large of functions. Make sure as your functions grow, you start to break them out into more functions so that they're more composable, readable, and maintainable. Unnecessary else statements. If you have an if statement and if that condition triggers and you have a return, you don't need an else because you otherwise would have already returned. So you can just continue to write code, assuming that if you make it to this point, that's the equivalent of the else, but you don't need to state it. Not short-circuiting loops. Let's say you want to iterate through an array and determine if there is an even number inside of that array. Well, the first even number you find gives you your answer of yes, so go ahead and return true and don't iterate through the rest of them. Double versus triple equals. Double equals does not take into account data type, whereas triple equals does. So make sure you understand how equality works in JavaScript. Incorrect object versus primitive comparisons. Again, going back to equality. Primitive values in JavaScript are stored as values versus object are stored as references to a space in memory where the values are stored. So that kind of messes up what you expect the equality to look like. So make sure you understand how primitives and objects get compared for equality in JavaScript. Cannot read property of undefined. Let's say you have a function and people pass you parameters. It's your responsibility to validate that that input is as you expect before you start trying to access properties of that object, which may be undefined. Mutation with arrays. Some array functions will mutate the original arrays, some will not. You need to know which ones are which. Not understanding asynchronous code. This is the biggest problem in JavaScript. Make sure you spend a lot of time trying to understand how asynchronous code works in JavaScript. Not handling errors. Make sure that as you write code, you ask yourself what happens if something goes wrong and you handle those use cases accordingly. And lastly, not formatting code. Similar to not naming your variables with good context, not formatting your code makes it extremely difficult to read, so make sure you invest time in formatting your code.